Hello, it's Psychocore. The dead girl who texted me back, Carl Jung's dark truth about your shadow. Before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, only if you like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to see who's joining us from around the world. I never told anyone this story. Not my therapist, not my closest friends, not even myself until 3 months ago when everything I thought I knew about reality shattered like glass hitting concrete. But I'm telling you because maybe you'll recognize something. Maybe you'll see the crack in your own mirror that you've been pretending doesn't exist. It started on a Tuesday morning. Nothing special about it. Coffee getting cold, notifications buzzing, the same grey sky outside my window. I was scrolling through my phone when I saw her face. Sarah Mitchell, my high school girlfriend, the one who got away, as they say, but that's not the story. The story is what happened when I clicked on her profile. She was dead, had been for 6 months. Car accident. The funeral photos were still there, people posting memories, her mother writing heartbreaking messages to a ghost. And here's the thing that broke me completely. I'd been texting with her for weeks, having full conversations, planning to meet up. She had been responding, real responses, personal things only she would know. I sat there staring at my phone, scrolling through our recent chat history. Her last message was from 2 days ago. Can't wait to see you again. It's been too long. The timestamp was there, the blue check marks showing she had read my messages. Everything looked normal except for one small detail that made my hands shake. She was dead. Now before you start thinking I'm losing my mind or making this up, let me tell you something. I checked everything. Screenshots, phone records, even called my phone company. The conversations were there. Real as the coffee getting cold in my hands. Real as the panic rising in my chest. Real as the sound of my own breathing getting faster and faster until I thought I might pass out. But here's where it gets really disturbing. When I started going through those messages more carefully, really reading them word by word, I began to notice something that made my skin crawl. The person I had been texting with wasn't Sarah, it was me. I was having conversations with myself, creating both sides of a dialogue I desperately needed to have but was too broken to admit. Carl Jung wrote about this phenomenon. He called it active imagination, but what he didn't prepare us for is how terrifying it becomes when your unconscious mind starts creating entire relationships to fill the void you've been ignoring. When your psyche becomes so desperate for connection that it literally manufactures the dead to keep you company. Every response I thought was coming from her was actually coming from a part of me that knew exactly what I needed to hear. The part that knew I was drowning in loneliness but was too proud to reach out to anyone real. The part that understood I'd been punishing myself for years for letting her go, for not fighting for us, for choosing safety over love when it mattered most. I spent the next 3 days going through every conversation we'd had over the past months. What I found there was more honest than any therapy session I'd ever had. This imaginary Sarah, this ghost I'd created, had been telling me truths about myself that I'd been running from for years. She told me I was afraid of intimacy because every person I'd ever loved had left. She told me I sabotage relationships before they can hurt me. She told me I work 16-hour days not because I'm ambitious, but because I'm terrified of silence, of being alone with my own thoughts. She told me I haven't looked in a mirror, really looked, in months because I'm disgusted with who I've become. And the most brutal part? She was right about everything. This wasn't some supernatural occurrence. This wasn't a glitch in the matrix or communication with the dead. This was my unconscious mind staging an intervention. My psyche had literally created an entire person to tell me what I couldn't tell myself, to have conversations I was too scared to have with anyone living. Jung called this the shadow self, that part of us we deny, repress, hide even from ourselves. But what happens when your shadow gets so powerful, so desperate to be heard, that it starts creating elaborate fantasies just to get your attention? What happens when the parts of yourself you've been ignoring become so loud they have to pretend to be other people just to make you listen? I realized I had been doing this my entire life, just in smaller ways. The imaginary arguments I'd have in the shower, the conversations I'd rehearse for situations that never happened, the way I'd replay interactions, editing them until they said what I wished I'd said. My mind had been trying to process emotions and experiences I was too afraid to feel directly. But Sarah was different. Sarah was complete. She had opinions, memories, inside jokes. She knew things about me that I'd forgotten. She called me out when I was being fake. She comforted me when I was scared. She was everything I needed and everything I was afraid to need. The day I discovered the truth, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cried, not the quiet, controlled tears of an adult trying to maintain dignity. I cried like a child, messy, desperate, ugly crying that came from somewhere so deep I didn't know it existed. I cried for Sarah, real Sarah, who died alone on a highway while I was probably checking emails. I cried for imaginary Sarah, who had been more real to me than anyone in my actual life. But mostly I cried for myself, for the part of me that was so lonely, so desperate for connection, that it had to resurrect the dead just to have someone to talk to. Here's what no one tells you about discovering your own psychological breaking point. It's not dramatic. There are no thunderclaps or movie moments, it's quiet. It's sitting in your kitchen at 3 a.m. staring at your phone, finally understanding that the person you've been having the most honest conversations with is yourself. It's realizing that you've been so disconnected from your own emotions that you had to create an entire person to feel them safely. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. What he didn't mention is how exhausting it becomes when your unconscious starts getting creative. When it stops being subtle and starts producing full-length psychological thrillers just to get your attention. The next morning I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called my sister. Not about work, not about family obligations, not about safe surface-level topics. I called her and said, "I need to tell you something and it's going to sound crazy, but I think I'm falling apart." That phone call saved my life. Not because she had answers, but because speaking the words out loud to another human being broke the spell. The moment I admitted that I had been manufacturing relationships with dead people, because I was too afraid to be vulnerable with living ones, something shifted. The elaborate fantasy structure my mind had built began to dissolve. But dissolving a fantasy you've been living in for months isn't like waking up from a dream. It's more like having a limb amputated. Suddenly this person who had been texting me daily, who knew all my secrets, who never judged me, who was always available, was gone, and I was left with the reality I'd been avoiding. I was alone, profoundly, completely alone in a way that felt like drowning in reverse. This is where most people stop. This is where the pain gets too intense and we go back to our coping mechanisms, our distractions, our carefully constructed ways of not feeling what we're feeling. But I couldn't go back because I had seen behind the curtain. I had seen how elaborate my mind's avoidance strategies had become. If I could create entire people to avoid dealing with loneliness, what else was I creating to avoid other uncomfortable truths? I started paying attention to the voice in my head, really listening to my internal dialogue for the first time in years. What I discovered was horrifying. That voice, the one I thought was me, wasn't me at all. It was a committee, a whole cast of characters I'd internalized over the years. My critical father telling me I wasn't working hard enough, my anxious mother warning me about every possible danger, my ex-girlfriend telling me I was too emotional, my high school teacher saying I'd never amount to anything. None of these voices were mine. They were all borrowed, collected, internalized from other people who had their own problems, their own fears, their own limitations, and I had been letting this committee run my life, make my decisions, tell me who I was and what I was worth. No wonder I felt crazy. I wasn't living my life. I was living everyone else's opinion of what my life should be. Jung called this the collective unconscious, but what he didn't adequately warn us about is how suffocating it becomes when you realize you haven't had an original thought in years. When you discover that every choice you've made, every relationship you've entered, every career move you've pursued has been influenced by voices that aren't even yours. The work of becoming who you actually are underneath all those borrowed voices is brutal. It's not the gentle self-improvement journey sold in books and seminars. It's archaeological. You have to dig through layers of conditioning, expectations, trauma, and learned behaviors to find the small, quiet voice that is actually you. And that voice, when you finally hear it, is often nothing like what you expected. My real voice, when I finally found it, was angry. Furious, actually. Angry at myself for wasting so much time being who other people wanted me to be. Angry at a world that teaches us to disconnect from ourselves so early that we forget we ever had a self to begin with. Angry at the elaborate ways we're taught to avoid our own pain, our own truth, our own authentic responses to life. But underneath the anger was something else, something I hadn't felt since I was a child. Curiosity. Genuine curiosity about who I might be if I stopped performing, stopped pretending, stopped trying to be acceptable to everyone else. What would I like if I wasn't worried about being judged? What would I want if I wasn't afraid of being disappointed? Who would I love if I wasn't terrified of being hurt? These aren't easy questions because answering them honestly means admitting that most of your life has been a performance. It means acknowledging that you've been living someone else's script while your real story has been waiting in the wings. Getting smaller and quieter with each passing year. The process of reclaiming your authentic self feels like dying and being reborn simultaneously. The person you thought you were starts to fade away, and you're left in this strange in-between space, where you're not who you used to be, but you don't know who you're becoming either. It's terrifying and exhilarating and lonely all at the same time. Friends and family start to notice. They say things like, "You seem different." Some of them like the difference, others don't. Some relationships deepen, others fall away. The people who are attracted to your false self aren't necessarily going to stick around for your real self. This is another kind of loss that no one prepares you for. But here's what I discovered in that space between death and rebirth. Freedom. Real freedom. Not the fake freedom of having enough money or the right job or the perfect relationship. The freedom that comes from knowing who you are and not apologizing for it. The freedom that comes from making choices based on your values, not your fears. The freedom that comes from being able to sit with yourself in silence, without needing to create elaborate fantasies or distractions just to tolerate your own presence. It's been 3 months since I discovered I was texting with a dead person. 3 months since I realized I'd been so disconnected from myself that my unconscious mind had to stage a psychological intervention just to get my attention. 3 months since I started the slow, difficult work of becoming real. I still feel lonely sometimes, but it's different now. It's honest loneliness. Not the desperate, suffocating isolation that comes from being surrounded by people while feeling completely unknown. I still hear those borrowed voices trying to tell me who I should be. But now I recognize them for what they are, echoes of other people's fears and limitations, not truths about who I am. And sometimes, late at night when I'm writing or reading or just sitting in the quiet, I feel something I haven't felt since I was a child. I feel like myself. Not the version of myself that tries to please everyone. Not the version that hides behind work and achievements and carefully curated social media posts. Just me, raw, unfiltered, imperfect, real me. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. What he didn't mention is that becoming who you truly are first requires destroying who you think you're supposed to be. It requires letting go of the fantasy self you've been maintaining and grieving for all the years you spent living someone else's life. The mirror breaks. That's how it starts. Some shock, some crisis, some moment when you can no longer pretend that your life is working the way you thought it was. And in that breaking, if you're brave enough to look at the pieces, you might see something you've been avoiding. You might see yourself, not the self you've been performing, but the self you've been hiding, the self that's been waiting patiently for you to stop running long enough to notice it was there all along. That self isn't perfect. It's not the optimized, successful, always positive version you've been trying to become. It's messy and complicated, and sometimes angry and often sad and occasionally brilliant and always, always real. And being real, it turns out, is the only thing that actually matters. The conversations with imaginary Sarah stopped the day I started having real conversations with myself. Not the critical borrowed voice conversations, but actual dialogues between the different parts of who I am. The part that's afraid and the part that's brave. The part that wants to hide and the part that wants to be seen. The part that's still healing and the part that's already whole. These internal conversations aren't crazy, they're necessary. They're what Jung called active imagination, and when done consciously, with awareness, they become a way of integrating all the different aspects of yourself instead of letting them fight each other in the shadows. I don't miss the imaginary Sarah anymore. What I was missing was never her anyway. It was the capacity for honest, vulnerable conversation. It was the feeling of being truly known by someone. It was the experience of having my thoughts and feelings witnessed without judgment. I thought I needed another person to give me these things. It turns out I needed to learn how to give them to myself first. This isn't a story about becoming comfortable with loneliness. It's a story about discovering that when you're truly connected to yourself, you're never really alone. When you can sit with your own thoughts without running. When you can feel your emotions without numbing them. When you can look at your own reflection without turning away, something miraculous happens. You become available for real connection with others. Not the desperate, needy connection that comes from trying to fill a void, but the generous, open connection that comes from being whole within yourself first. The work continues. Every day, I practice listening to my real voice instead of the committee. Every day, I choose authenticity over acceptability. Every day, I risk being seen as I actually am instead of hiding behind the mask I used to think was keeping me safe. Some days are harder than others. Some days the old patterns try to reassert themselves. But I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't unknow what I know. The mirror has broken, and there's no going back to the illusion of who I thought I was supposed to be. Jung said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. What he meant is that the world around us is constantly showing us our own hidden aspects, our own denied parts, our own unconscious patterns. The imaginary Sarah wasn't just a fantasy. She was a mirror, reflecting back to me everything I needed to see about myself, but was too afraid to look at directly. Now I see these mirrors everywhere, in the people who annoy me, who trigger me, who make me uncomfortable. Instead of turning away or getting defensive, I ask myself what they might be showing me about my own inner world. Instead of projecting my problems onto others, I take responsibility for my own psychological material. Instead of trying to change everyone around me, I focus on changing the only person I actually have any control over, myself. This is the real work of growing up, not achieving external markers of success, but developing the capacity to be honest with yourself about who you are, what you feel, what you need, what you fear, what you love. It's learning to tolerate the full spectrum of human experience without running away, numbing out, or creating elaborate fantasies to avoid the intensity of being alive. The mirror breaks, and in the breaking you finally see clearly. You see that you've been living in a house of mirrors, surrounded by distorted reflections of who you think you should be. You see that authenticity isn't a destination but a practice. You see that becoming yourself isn't something you do once, but something you choose again and again, moment by moment, day by day, for the rest of your life. And if you're very lucky, if you're very brave, you might discover what I discovered in those ruins of my carefully constructed false self. That who you really are underneath all the masks and performances and borrowed voices is more interesting, more capable, more lovable than who you thought you were supposed to be. That your real self, the one you've been hiding and protecting and keeping secret, is actually the greatest gift you have to offer the world. The conversation with the dead was really a conversation with myself. The breaking was really a breakthrough. The end was really a beginning. And sometimes, late at night in the quiet, I swear I can still feel that imaginary Sarah smiling. Proud of me for finally learning to have the conversations I needed to have with the only person who was always there, always listening, always waiting for me to come home to myself. If you enjoyed this video, please support the channel, like, share, and subscribe. Please leave a comment telling us what you think of this video.